She did it because she had to. She was used to disappearing. Used to the weight of the coarse wool against her skin. Used to the silent rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock that reminded her she was still alive, still hidden, still safe. "Your tea, sir," Margaret said, her voice a practiced whisper, neutral enough to be part of the furniture. She moved with the fluid, invisible grace of a girl who had spent 90 days perfecting the art of being nobody. He didn't look up from his ledger. He didn't thank her. He didn't acknowledge that a daughter of an earl was currently smoothing his linens. No one suspected her. Not really. Then, as the gold teapot tilted, his hand moved. It wasn't the slow, clumsy movement of an employer, but the swift, sure strike of a predator claiming its prize. His fingers closed around her wrist, stopping the amber stream mid-air. The silence in the study thickened, heavy as a shroud. He did not let go. He did not look surprised. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who had been counting the seconds until she broke. Margaret felt the room dissolve until there was only the heat of his touch. The game of the housekeeper was over. Nathaniel Pembroke had found his countess. The study at Pembroke Manor was a sanctuary of leather and dust. Rows of books climbed the walls like silent witnesses. The morning sun slanted through the heavy velvet drapes, catching the steam rising from the porcelain cup. It was a room designed for quiet thoughts and cold business. But Margaret felt none of the peace. She stood frozen by the edge of the mahogany desk, her eyes wide, her breath hitching in the back of her throat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The man holding her arm was the only person in the county who could destroy her. Nathaniel Pembroke, wealthy, observant, a man whose influence reached into the very corridors of power she had fled. He was a man whispered about for his sharp mind and avoided for his lack of mercy. A man who never missed a detail. And for 3 months, she had served him in silence, believing she was the one watching him. Beside the tea tray, her hand trembled. "You are spilling it, Lady Margaret," he said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. It wasn't a question. It was an execution. The porcelain clattered against the tray, a sharp, dissonant sound in the suffocating quiet of the study. Nathaniel's grip on her arm did not slacken. It was firm, warm, and entirely undoing. Margaret's mind, usually a fortress of ironclad composure, suddenly flooded with the ghosts of the last 90 days. 3 months ago, she had arrived at the tradesman's entrance of Pembroke Manor in a drenching rain, her silk slippers ruined and her heart nearly stopped. The news of the tragic carriage accident at Thornefield had already reached the papers, a convenient fiction crafted by a cousin with a hunger for land and a lack of soul. To the world, the Countess of Thornefield was a charred memory. To Margaret, survival meant shedding her name like a bloodied gown. She had stood before Nathaniel's housekeeper with downcast eyes, scrubbing the dirt of her heritage from under her fingernails until they bled, praying that a blue cotton dress and a white apron would be shroud enough. She had been a shadow in his halls. She had learned the exact temperature he preferred in his Darjeeling, the way he liked his letters sorted by the wax seal's color, and the heavy, rhythmic sound of his boots on the oak floorboards. She thought she was the hunter, the observer, the silent witness to his life. But as Nathaniel looked at her now, his expression wasn't one of discovery, it was one of recognition. "I knew you before you ever touched that teapot," he thought, his thumb brushing the pulse point of her wrist. He remembered the girl from the winter ball 3 years prior, the one who had laughed at the absurdity of the sapphire necklace she wore, the one whose eyes held a fire that no amount of kitchen soot could truly extinguish. He had watched her for 3 months with a fascination that bordered on obsession. He had seen the way she held her spine too straight for a commoner, the way her fingers danced over the piano keys when she thought the drawing room was empty, and the way she flinched whenever the morning paper mentioned the Thornefield succession. Every time she bowed her head to him, he felt a surge of dark amusement and protective fury. She was a lioness pretending to be a mouse, and he had been content to let her play the part, until the spies began to circle his gates. "You thought the silence was your armor, Margaret," he murmured, his voice vibrating through her skin. "But I have been listening to everything you didn't say. I have watched you mourn your own life in my kitchen." Margaret's breath hitched. The 3 months of safety felt like a glass floor shattering beneath her feet. She wasn't a hidden servant, she was a bird in a gilded cage, and the man who held the key had been watching her beat her wings against the bars the entire time. Nathaniel did not release her wrist as he stood. his chair scraping against the floor with a finality that made Margaret flinch. He led her not toward the door where the other servants might be lingering, but toward the heavy oak bookshelves that lined the far wall. With a practiced flick of a hidden lever disguised as a leather-bound spine, a section of the wall groaned and swung inward. The room beyond was not a cellar or a closet, but a second, smaller study, a nerve center of ink and secrets. The air here smelled of fresh parchment and cold iron. Maps of the Thornefield estate were pinned to the walls, crisscrossed with red string and charcoal notes. On the central desk lay a stack of dossiers thick enough to bury a man's reputation. "You think I hired a housekeeper because I was short of staff, Margaret?" Nathaniel's voice was low, devoid of the amused mask he had worn moments ago. He released her at last, but only to spread a set of bank ledgers across the desk. "I tracked you from the moment you left the wreckage of that carriage. I didn't hire you to clean my house. I hired you because this manor is the only fortress in the county that your cousin's reach cannot penetrate." Margaret stepped closer, her trembling hand reaching out to touch a familiar seal, the Thornefield crest, stamped in black wax on a letter she recognized as her father's. "You've been stealing my family's correspondence," she whispered, the shock of it warring with a sudden, sharp hope. "I've been intercepting the evidence they tried to burn," Nathaniel corrected. He turned to face her, his silhouette sharp against the candlelight. "Your cousin, Lord Julian, has already begun liquidating the northern tenant farms. He's paying off the magistrate to expedite the death certificate. If I had simply handed these to the courts 3 months ago, you would have been intercepted and killed before you could testify. You needed to stay dead until I could dismantle his allies one by one." Margaret looked up at him, her eyes searching the hard lines of his face. The man she thought was a distant, cold employer was a strategist who had been fighting a silent war in her name. "Why?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What is your motive in this, Nathaniel? No man risks treason for a missing girl he barely remembers from a ball." Nathaniel leaned in, his gaze steady and unyielding. "I don't remember a girl, Margaret. I remember a woman who stood in a ballroom and looked at the world as if she intended to fix it. I didn't want a servant. I wanted a partner who owed me nothing but the truth." He tapped the ledger. "The trap is set. But to spring it, the Countess must finally come home." Margaret backed away from the desk, her hips bumping against the mahogany edge as the magnitude of his confession crashed over her. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick with the scent of old ink and the crushing weight of Nathaniel's gaze. For 3 months, she had lived by a single rule: trust no one. It was the rule that had kept her heart beating when the carriage went over the cliff, and the rule that had guided her hands as she scrubbed his floors. Now, he was asking her to set that rule on fire. "You've been playing a game with my life," she whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a burgeoning, defensive rage. "You watched me sleep under your roof, eat your bread, and live in terror, all while you held the keys to my father's house in a locked drawer?" Nathaniel stepped toward her, his expression softening but his silhouette remaining as immovable as stone. "I held the keys so Julian wouldn't melt them down, Margaret. If you had appeared a day sooner, you would have been a martyr. Now, you can be a victor." "And what if I don't want to be either?" she snapped, her hand flying to the door handle. The instinct to run was a physical ache in her limbs. She thought of the small satchel hidden beneath her floorboards, the few coins she had managed to save, the simple map, the life of a quiet seamstress in a town where no one knew the name Thornefield. It was a small life, a gray life, but it was hers. Nathaniel didn't move to stop her this time. He simply watched her, his hands clasped behind his back. "Go then," he said, his voice dropping to a low, challenging silk. "Step out that door. Walk to the village. But know that Julian's men are already at the Boar's Head Inn. They found the ribbon you dropped in the woods a week ago. They are closer than you think, Margaret." She froze, her fingers white against the brass knob. The safety of the manor suddenly felt like a thin veil being shredded by a cold wind. She looked at the maps on the wall, the red strings tied to her fate, and then back at the man who had turned her life into his private chess match. "You're the only person who can keep me safe," she realized, the truth bitter on her tongue. "I am the only person who has a reason to," he replied. "But safety is a boring thing, Countess. Don't you want your revenge?" Margaret let go of the handle. She looked at her reddened, chapped hands, the hands of a servant, and then at the Thornefield seal. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, the fire Nathaniel remembered from the winter ball began to flicker back to life. She wasn't going to run. Not anymore. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long, dancing shadows across the maps pinned to the wall. Margaret finally sank into the velvet chair, the heavy apron of her hale persona feeling like lead. She looked at her hands, reddened by lie and toughened by 3 months of labor, and began to speak, her voice hollow as she recounted the night the carriage plummeted into the ravine. "My cousin Julian didn't just want the estate," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the Thornefield crest. "He wanted the lineage erased. He had the axle sawn halfway through. I felt the snap, the sickening tilt, and then the world was nothing but screaming horses and breaking wood." She shivered, the phantom cold of the river water seeping into her bones. "I crawled out through a broken window while the carriage was still settled in the silt. I watched from the tree-lean as his men arrived, not to save me, but to ensure there were no survivors. I ran until my lungs burned, and I didn't stop until I saw your help-wanted sign in the village." Nathaniel stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the moonlight. He didn't offer hollow platitudes. He simply listened, his silence a heavy, respectful weight. "You played the part well, Margaret," he said, turning back to her. A faint, knowing smile touched his lips. "But you were never a servant. A real housekeeper doesn't flinch when the silver is tarnished," she sighs. "You handled the silver as if it were an old friend you were ashamed to meet in the kitchen." Margaret looked up, surprised. "You saw that?" "I saw everything," Nathaniel replied, stepping into the circle of candlelight. "I saw the way you corrected the grammar in my draft letters when you thought I wasn't looking. I saw how you carried your head, not with the bowed neck of a girl born to service, but with the weary grace of a queen in exile. And that morning in the garden, when the rose bushes caught your hem, you didn't curse like a maid. You stood perfectly still and waited for the world to apologize to you. That was the moment I knew for certain." The tension between them shifted, no longer just a master and a fugitive, but two players who had finally turned their cards face up. Margaret felt a strange, terrifying prickle of heat. He hadn't just been protecting a countess. He had been studying the woman beneath the title. "I am not that woman anymore," she said firmly, though her heart betrayed her with a sudden, rapid beat. "No," Nathaniel agreed, his eyes locking onto hers with unsettling intensity. "You are something much more dangerous now. You are a woman who knows what it's like to have nothing. And that is exactly what we need for what comes next." The heavy iron knocker on the front door sounded, 3 sharp, authoritative strikes that echoed through the stone hallways of Pembroke Manor like a death knell. Margaret stood abruptly, the rustle of her stiff apron sounding like a scream in the quiet study. "Julian's man," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to a low, calm vibration. He didn't look startled, he looked ready. He stepped toward the window, peering through the heavy drapes. "It is Mr. Holloway, your cousin's personal solicitor. The man who signed your death certificate." The blood drained from Margaret's face, leaving her skin as pale as the porcelain she had spent months scrubbing. Her breath came in shallow, jagged gasps. Holloway had known her since she was a child. He had sat at her father's table. He would know the shape of her jaw, the specific shade of her eyes, even beneath a layer of kitchen soot. "I have to hide," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the secret door. "No," Nathaniel said, his hand catching her shoulder. His grip was a grounding weight. "If you hide, he will wonder why my study is locked. He will smell the fear in this house. You are Margaret Hale, the housekeeper. You are going to open that door, you are going to take his coat, and you are going to serve us refreshment." "Nathaniel, I can't. You have been a shadow for 90 days, Margaret. Be a shadow for 10 more minutes." He tilted her chin up, his gaze searing into hers. "Look at me. You are invisible." He sees a uniform, not a woman. Do not give him a reason to look closer. Margaret swallowed hard, her throat tight and dry. She smoothed her apron with trembling hands, tucked a stray lock of brown hair back into her neat updo, and nodded. She stepped out of the study, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. When she opened the massive front door, the cold wind of the English afternoon swept in, bringing with it the scent of wet earth and the sharp, clinical aroma of Holloway's cologne. The solicitor stood there, tall and spindly, holding a leather briefcase. "Is Mr. Pembroke receiving?" Holloway asked, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't even look at her face. He held out his damp greatcoat without waiting for her to take it. "He is, sir," Margaret murmured, her voice a perfect, toneless chime. She took the heavy wool coat, her fingers brushing the fabric that had likely been paid for with her family's stolen gold. She felt a surge of cold fury, but she kept her eyes downcast, focused on the polished toes of his boots. She led him to the drawing room, her steps silent on the carpet. As she set the tray down, the gold teapot glinting mockingly in the light, Holloway finally looked up. He squinted, his eyes trailing from her hands to the line of her neck. "Have we met, girl?" he asked, his voice sharpening with a sudden predatory curiosity. "You have a certain carriage." Nathaniel stepped into the room, his smile as smooth as glass. "She's a treasure, isn't she, Holloway? Found her in a village gutter. She has the grace of a thoroughbred, but the silence of a grave. Leave us, Hale." Margaret curtsied, her knees steady by some miracle of sheer will. She turned and walked away, feeling Holloway's eyes boring into her back until the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her. The door to the drawing room had barely clicked shut before Margaret's knees buckled. She leaned against the wainscoting in the hallway, her breath coming in jagged, silent gasps. The phantom sensation of Holloway's gaze felt like a physical stain on her skin. She had been a ghost in her own home, and for a terrifying second, the ghost had been seen. A moment later, the drawing room door reopened. Holloway had been escorted to the foyer by a footman, but Nathaniel stepped into the hall, his face a mask of cold, sharp fury. He didn't speak until they were back within the soundproof sanctuary of the study. "He felt it," Margaret whispered, her hands shaking so violently she had to hide them in the folds of her apron. "He looked at me and he felt the Countess." "He felt a shadow he couldn't categorize," Nathaniel corrected, though his jaw remained tight. He walked to the desk and slammed a heavy brass paperweight down onto a map of the Thornefield borders. "Which means our timeline has just shifted from months to days. If Holloway returns to your cousin with even a seed of doubt, they won't send a solicitor next time. They'll send an assassin." The realization settled over the room like a layer of frost. The 3 months of silence were over. They were no longer hiding, they were hunting. "What do we do?" Margaret asked, her voice shedding its servant's lilt and regaining the iron ring of her heritage. Nathaniel pulled a stack of vellum from a drawer. "We bait the trap. Julian is greedy, but he is also paranoid. He's currently trying to secure a loan against the Thornefield timber rights to pay off his gambling debts. If an anonymous investor, someone with a reputation for discretion and deep pockets, were to demand proof of a clean title and a verified death certificate, Julian will scramble." "He'll forge them," Margaret said. "Exactly. And when he brings those forgeries to the London assizes to prove his claim, he'll be handing us the rope for his own gallows." Nathaniel dipped a quill into black ink and held it out to her. "But I cannot write the letters that trigger his paranoia. Only someone who knows the private ledgers of Thornefield can do that. Only someone who knows which closet holds which skeleton." Margaret looked at the quill, then at the man who had turned his life into a shield for hers. She reached out, her fingers brushing his as she took the pen. The touch was electric, a spark of shared purpose that went deeper than the secrets they kept. "I know where every bone is buried, Nathaniel," she said, her eyes flashing with a cold, brilliant light. They spent the night huddled over the desk, their shadows merging against the walls. Margaret dictated the intimate details of the estate's debts and hidden assets, while Nathaniel mapped out the legal web. For the first time since the carriage went over the cliff, Margaret wasn't just surviving. She was striking back. The following morning, the transformation began not with a legal document, but with the sound of a heavy trunk being dragged across the floorboards of a disused guest wing. Nathaniel had summoned Madame Giry, a woman whose discretion was as legendary as her stitchwork. She had arrived in a closed carriage, her eyes sharp and her mouth shut tight, seeing not a housemaid in a blue apron, but a mannequin for a resurrection. "The girl is gone, madam," Nathaniel said, standing by the window of the dressing-room, his back turned to respect the propriety he had ignored for months. "I need the Countess of Thornefield. She must look as though she has been grieving in a French convent, not scrubbing my hearth." Margaret stood in the center of the room, her arms held out like wooden dolls as Madame Giry's measuring tape snapped against her skin. The coarse wool of her servant's dress was stripped away, falling to the floor in a heap of anonymity. In its place came layers of fine lawn, silk stays, and finally, a gown of midnight blue velvet that felt dangerously heavy. "You have lost weight, mon ange," Madame Giry murmured, her pins clicking against her teeth. "But the bone structure... magnifique. It is the face of a woman who has seen the devil and survived." As the corset was tightened, Margaret felt the breath leave her, but her spine snapped into a forgotten, regal alignment. The hale slouch, the subservient tilt of the head, the rounded shoulders of a girl trying to be smaller than the world, all of it vanished. When the final hook was fastened, she stepped toward the full-length mirror. She gasped. The woman in the reflection was a stranger. Her skin, once sallow from kitchen steam, looked like alabaster against the dark velvet. Her hair, freed from its tight, utilitarian bun, was piled high in a crown of mahogany waves. Nathaniel turned then. The silence that followed was longer than any they had shared over tea. His gaze traveled from her hem to her throat, where a single modest sapphire hung, a piece he had retrieved from his own family vault. His expression, usually so guarded, flickered with something raw and unmistakable. It wasn't just admiration, it was the look of a man seeing a masterpiece he had spent a lifetime waiting to claim. "Margaret," he said, his voice a low, rough anchor. "I feel exposed," she whispered, her hand fluttering to her throat. The apron was a shield. "This feels like a target." Nathaniel walked toward her, stopping just inches away. He didn't touch her. The velvet was a barrier now, a symbol of her restored rank, but the heat of him was a physical force. "The target is Julian now, Margaret. You are no longer the prey. You are the High Court." He held out a pair of silk gloves. "Put these on. We have a ball to attend, and a cousin to destroy." The Thornefield estate was a tomb of memories, its windows glowing with a deceptive, festive light. Julian had thrown a grand ball to celebrate his official ascension, a final act of arrogance before the ink on the forged death certificates could even dry. Carriages lined the drive like black beetles, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and desperation. Margaret stood in the shadows of the carriage, her fingers digging into the velvet of her skirts. Beside her, Nathaniel's profile was a sharp, uncompromising blade against the moonlight. He reached over, his gloved hand covering hers, not to restrain her, but to steady the tremor she couldn't hide. "1 hour, Margaret," he murmured. "1 hour of being the woman they think is under the earth, and you will never have to hide again." They stepped into the light. The grand ballroom of Thornefield was exactly as she remembered, yet hauntingly distorted. Julian stood near the hearth, glass in hand, holding court with the very men who had helped him orchestrate the accident. He looked older, his face bloated by a sudden influx of wealth and the rot of a guilty conscience. As the major domo began the announcements, Nathaniel stepped forward, his presence commanding the room's attention. "Mr. Nathaniel Pembroke," the man called out. Then, his voice faltered, his eyes widening as he looked at the woman on Nathaniel's arm. He knew her. He had served her father for 20 years. "And guessed," the man whispered, his courage failing him. Margaret didn't wait. She swept into the room, her midnight blue velvet trailing behind her like a storm cloud. The music didn't stop all at once. It withered, note by note, as heads turned. It was a ripple of shock that turned into a freezing wave. Julian's glass hit the marble floor. The sound of shattering crystal was the only thing that broke the silence. He went gray, his eyes bulging as if he were seeing a literal corpse walk through the gilded doors. "Julian," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't the whisper of a servant or the scream of a victim. It was a bell, clear and terrifyingly resonant. "I heard you were having a celebration. It seemed a pity to miss it, considering it is being held in my house." You are dead," Julian stammered, backing into the mantel. "The certificates, the magistrate." "The magistrate is currently being detained at Pembroke Manor," Nathaniel said, stepping into the light beside her, his expression one of bored lethargy that hid a lethal intent. "Along with the forgeries you were so kind as to sign this morning. It seems there was a slight error in your accounting, Lord Julian." The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers. Margaret didn't look at the crowd. She looked only at the man who had stolen her life. She took a step toward him, and for the first time in 3 months, she felt the full weight of the Thornefield name. "The game is over, cousin," she said softly. "The housekeeper has finished her work." The morning after the fall of the House of Thornefield, the sun rose over Pembroke Manor with a clarity that seemed to scrub the world clean. The frantic energy of the arrests, the shouting of the constables, and the pale, trembling face of Julian as he was led away in irons had faded into a quiet, ringing stillness. Margaret sat in the small breakfast parlour, the very room where she had once stood in a stiff apron, counting the seconds until she could escape back to the kitchens. Today, she wore a simple gown of soft grey silk, her own choice, neither servant's wool nor a target's velvet. She looked out at the frost-dusted gardens and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the absence of the weight in her chest. The door opened, and Nathaniel entered. He wasn't wearing his formal green coat or his waistcoat. He was in his shirt-sleeves, his hair slightly undone, looking less like a distant master and more like a man who had finally finished a long, exhausting journey. In his hands, he carried a tray. Margaret started to rise, the instinct of 3 months pulling at her muscles. "Nathaniel, you shouldn't." "Sit, Margaret," he said, his voice warm and devoid of its usual sharp edge. He set the tray down on the low table between them. There was no gold teapot today, only a simple ceramic one and 2 mismatched cups. He poured the tea with a steady hand, the amber liquid steaming in the cool morning air. He handed her a cup and sat across from her. For a long moment, they simply drank in silence, a silence that was no longer a mask or a shield, but a bridge. "The solicitors arrived an hour ago," Nathaniel said quietly. "The restoration of your titles is a formality now. Thornefield is yours again. You could leave this afternoon if you wished." Margaret looked at the tea, then at the man who had seen through her every lie and loved the truth he found beneath them. She thought of the cold, empty halls of her family estate, and then at the warmth of the room they were in. "I spent 3 months learning every corner of this house," she said, a small, genuine smile playing on her lips. "It would be a pity to leave it just as I've finally learned where the master keeps the good biscuits." Nathaniel's eyes sparked with that familiar, intrigued amusement, but this time it was touched by something deeper, a quiet, enduring hope. "The biscuits are on the top sideboard. But the master is right here, and he finds he rather dislikes the idea of tea for one." Margaret reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. It wasn't a servant's touch or a countess's command. It was the beginning. "Then I suppose," she whispered, "we shall have to make tea for 2. Outside, the winter air was cold, but inside, the fire was bright, and the tea was perfectly warm. The missing countess had been found, and the man who had known her all along had finally stopped watching and started living.